Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today's episode, I'm going to be tackling a title that may look familiar to longtime viewers, as I received a review key for GameChange Studios' My Lovely Wife, the spiritual successor to their horror-infused management sim, My Lovely Daughter. That said, rather than play the part of Pygmalion producing an alchemical Galatia, your particular endeavors have you summoning up Succubi to do your bidding, which gets pretty questionable pretty quickly. And that begs the question, was this newest entry a delightfully dark take on death, dating, and dark magic, or did My Lovely Wife suck big time? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. It was in the city of Harbloth that Jake sought out opportunity and found it. First as a chaperone to the talented songstress Luna, then as her manager, before the professional boundaries between them broke down and changed their dynamic into something more intimate still. Ultimately, it culminated in the moment where he gathered the courage to ask her hand in marriage and she responded in kind. Yet all good things must end, his personal fairy tale coming to an abrupt and violent finale when a mysterious home invasion turns fatal. Freshly widowed, Jake has nothing but his grief to grant him company. At least, until a mysterious missive arrives at his door, a posthumous letter from his love which hints that her tragic fate might be averted. Undone. Even more eerie is the appearance of a mysterious researcher, Philip, who initiates Jake into the secrets of Succubi summoning, with the promise that they might hold the key to reuniting him with his wife. Provided, of course, that he can learn to harness their talent for harvesting carnal essence. And let me stop you right there because I fucking assure you this is not a lead-in for debauched hentai. And no, there isn't an R18 patch in the pipeline. I'm pretty sure. Anyways, what you can expect is a story that gradually unfurls in dialogue segments accompanying each of the game's chapters, serving to highlight the tragedy of Jake's situation, the sordid circumstances he's found himself immersed in as the master of innumerable demonesses, and the secrets of the town itself. Secrets which ultimately see you dragged into a conflict between the two factions within Harbloth, seeking answers as to their agendas, even as they vie for dominion over Jake's fate, and the carnal essence he's gathering. A struggle which ultimately sees you picking one of two exclusive endings. But well, that wasn't actually the meat of the narrative for me. While there were interesting elements of horror and mystery to be found in the central plot, some of the segments felt less like an organic narrative and more like the game was simply using the scenes as a vehicle to introduce game mechanics. Worse, while the central endings were overall fitting for the vibe of the game, that didn't stop them from leaving a bad taste in my mouth, in part because by the time I was picking them, I'd found myself looking for a third option because of the way the plot had been progressing and my overall suspicions. That, and because all of the side story segments left me asking a lot of questions. And what I mean by this is that the courtship dialogue you get with all of the various succubi, as each demoness has a dialogue tree you can explore, which helps to flesh out details about their clan, how they interact with each other, and even details about the underworld, its politics, and its history. Simply put, the tete-a-tetes I had with my sensual summonees were the moments My Lovely Wife started to feel a bit more like a visual novel, albeit one which initially had a bit of a limited scope given that the majority of the options will be inaccessible to you at first. It actually takes a considerable amount of grinding to gain the necessary stats to pursue every option in their dialogue chains, and yet doing so does feel worthwhile, and somewhat accessible given the game's kind enough to keep track of which dialogue options you've picked with a given succubi. What's more, once you become socially deft enough, chatting up your otherworldly waifus has a secondary benefit, as you can choose to simply opt out of reviving your wife. That's right, you can instead elope with an NU, take on a Bareth bride, or some other infernal flavor of fiancé. While these outcomes are a lot shorter, they're a fun change of pace from the central story, especially since each succubi has a good and bad outcome to her courtship, resulting in 40 side endings in total. Endings which you can pursue within the same save file, making it a good way to break up the grind you'll engage with. And there'll be a fair amount of that really, given the management elements which serve as My Lovely Wife's central gameplay loop. See, in order to gain the resources needed for Philip's experimental research, Jake proceeds to put his grandiose succubi summoning powers to use by running an escort service, I shit you not. Essentially, each day tasks you with actively managing your hellish harem in real time, sending them out to various facilities. This can range from training up their etiquette and charm, or their, flair. Kinkiness. That said, you'll be primarily sending them out to generate resources, whether it be entertaining at the hotel for all the gold you'll be needing to upgrade the range of services your facilities provide, and to buy items, or banging out back-to-back shots at the bordello to earn carnal essence to progress the plot. Speaking of which, both the areas you unlock that serve as dumping grounds for the succubi's excess essence also serve auxiliary purposes. I don't just mean the occasional story request from a succubus in order to advance her storyline. Specifically, the ruins area sells basic level summoning materials so you can diversify your devil dames, and extra rooms so you can host more of them at home up to the cap of 5. The temple, on the other hand, has a somewhat more arbitrary selection of materials, but they tend to be of higher quality, which helps a lot insofar as summoning up better quality succubi off the hop. They also let you buy items to ramp up your succubi's affection, which is normally relegated to clearing a succubi's request or taking them to dates at the park. Affection's fairly useful since it does allow you to consummate the relationship, but it also drains from sending them to more demanding jobs. But well, here's the thing. Unlike my lovely daughter, the gameplay loop feels a lot simpler. For one thing, there's absolutely nothing preventing you from simply using and abusing your succubi, other than the knowledge that you're being a bit of a prick, and that's because even if you leave their affection at 0 and overwork them day after day with the most arduous tasks, they won't rebel. Instead, affection simply serves as a measure of how much of their dialogue you can progress through if they'll react poorly to poking them in their rooms, and again, that whole consummation of the relationship thing. Which, speaking of advancements, if you're adverse to checking out the park area and going on dates and just happen to be swimming in cash, that whole gift system has also been simplified from my lovely daughter, as all the items are equally effective on any type of succubi, with the only real difference being their overall cost efficiency. And spoilers, it's more efficient to just buy 10 of the cheapest ones, given there's nothing preventing you from spamming your gifts on your girls. I mean, other than having a finite amount of patience, but that is clearly not a thing I have, considering these stupid things I've done in these reviews and on stream. But wait! The systemic simplification is far from over. It extends to the task too, as you don't actually have to be overly mindful of any sort of affinity on the succubi's part that might make them incompatible with a given job, nor are there requests that might require you to be mindful of the loadout of succubi at your disposal. In fact, the gains you garner from working jobs is solely based on a given girl's stats and their traits. That said, while the stats are simple enough to level up from training or just using better summoning components, traits at least do have a bit of nuance to them, and some rather funny quirks. See, traits do things like provide a succubus with a passive modifier, which can either negatively or positively influence her stat gains, resource gains, and even affection, and they can start with them. That said, the arbitrary nature of starting traits is to such an extent that it's entirely possible for a succubi to start with a positive and negative trait, which are mirrors to each other, causing them to break even and waste 2 trait slots in one breath. This sense of randomness doesn't end there either, as you can also garner traits from visiting locations repeatedly. That said, there are a few factors which are predictable. For one thing, mini-events will occasionally occur, which provide you with a tiny bit of flavor text and a pair of options. While these can be used to garner resources, they also occasionally provide the opportunity to garner either a positive or negative trait, which can be extremely useful. What's more, certain options in a succubi story route will also provide guaranteed traits, which can go a long way towards getting a solid team of, workers. God, that feels gross to say. Though, not quite as bad as the part where you engage in a whole lot of serial murder to progress the game, because, well, as much as it'd be nice to progress by organizing a cabaret of Dante-esque dancers, you'll hit a bit of a dead end insofar as both the main story and the succubi side stories unless you start stabbing. And that's because ritualistic homicide is the only manner in which Jake can absorb a succubi's accumulated carnal essence for himself and level up his own stats. A process which not only enables his ability to actually pursue more challenging dialogue options, but also boosts the efficiency of all his facilities and makes his succubi starting and maximum stats grow stronger. It's also necessary for engaging with the game's actual ending, since it requires certain skills capped out in order to properly enact a certain route. Cording them first does make it substantially more efficient insofar as essence gains, but it also makes you a fucking creep. So just get their endings instead. You'll get the carnal essence, and it'll be a lot more wholesome some of the time. Speaking of which, I do have to give my lovely wife credit here. The overall aesthetic to the title is pretty nice to look at. I personally enjoyed the various succubi designs a great deal and found quite a few of them memorable. Though I absolutely adored the Nocti, the Acklys, the Bastet, and the Enyos. The fact that they also have some animations to accompany their dialogue was a lot of fun. That said, I would argue the overall aesthetic this time around is a bit less disturbing if you were hoping for horrors. Specifically, where my lovely daughter focused on hammering home the brutality and intrinsic betrayals involved in the disposal of each daughter, my lovely wife's executions are essentially an identical process, with all the focus being placed instead on the two ending scenes pertaining to their story routes. That and the cute gallery scene you get for going on a date at High Affection. Some of those are just plain wholesome. It's not to say that they're not worthwhile or well-crafted bits of design, it's just if you were hoping to be horribly uncomfortable, you might be a little bit disappointed there. Though going back to the whole wholesome thing, the same can't be said of the audio design, and I don't just mean because some of the sound effects sound awfully lewd. Those dates are at a public park, Jake. No, beyond that, there's a decent gamut of sounds for the various succubi, which help to reflect their moods as you chat them up or send them off to work, or send them to their deaths. It helps to set up the ambience just like the soundtrack, which I admittedly don't mind, even though I did wind up listening to the same few tracks for quite some time. In any case, that brings us to the conclusion, and what I ultimately have to conclude about my lovely wife is at its core, it feels like a prettier, but ultimately more streamlined and casual experience than its predecessor. This isn't necessarily a bad thing if you're just picking up the game in order to peruse the story and chat up cute succubi, but even then, the individual storylines are fairly short and often interrupted by small requests from the side quests, which require you to re-engage with the grind. And quite frankly, while I did enjoy those various mini-endings, a part of me wanted more. Because there's so many plot elements that are hinted at, but which are ultimately left unresolved. And here's the thing, that wouldn't have actually been a major problem were it not for how iterative the day-to-day process was. While town events occur that bar you access from a specific facility or increase the efficiency of one, it was still fairly rare for it to majorly shift around my plans for a given day, if only because your itinerary could be summed up as train succubus, throw succubus at best rated jobs, wait for the timer to run down, repeat. Day in, day out. And occasionally, if a succubus picks up more bad traits, you need more carnal essence, or you're just feeling stabby, you take her behind the watershed in order to advance your stats, and make room for tinkering around with materials to summon a brand new type of succubus to seduce. And honestly, between those two factors, I find myself feeling that this title was a fumble. There's certainly elements about it that I like, but it feels a bit more flawed insofar as its content. That said, I still did enjoy it, and hell if I'm not a sucker for cute monster waifus. Still, I would be lying if I didn't say I wasn't hoping for a content update, or something similar to the Inquisitor DLC that its predecessor received. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you at the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.